Assassin's Creed 2, Assassin's Creed Brotherhood. These two games are the ones I hear brought up the most when in discussion for the best AC game. And it's no wonder why. Both games are part of the beloved Ezio trilogy, and both feature some of the best storytelling, world building, and gameplay mechanics of the series. So today we are going to compare these two games on their stories, gameplay, open world, and presentation to determine which game is better. I will be scoring each game on several different categories, which I will leave on screen, and whichever game by the end has the most points will be, in my opinion, the better game. So without further ado, AC2 versus AC Brotherhood. The first category we are going to talk about are the protagonists. Now obviously the protagonist of both games is the legend himself, Ezio Auditore. So I'm going to compare Ezio's growth and personality in each game. Assassin's Creed 2 is the origin and setup for the Ezio trilogy. We get to see him from his literal birth, then as a young and immature adult, and by the end a mature and wise deadly assassin. Ezio's character development and growth in Assassin's Creed 2 is, in my opinion at least, one of the best character arcs in a video game, and seeing Ezio over a 22-year time span was very cool, and it really gives this big sense of growth and journey. Brotherhood takes place immediately after AC2, so Ezio at this point is pretty much already fully developed and matured. We don't see a whole lot of character growth from him in Brotherhood, which in all fairness we don't really need to see since we already got that in AC2, but it does make him a little less intriguing to watch. Now don't get me wrong, he's still great in Brotherhood, but his journey in AC2 is among the best in all single player games in my opinion, so this point goes to Assassin's Creed 2. The next category are the antagonists. The antagonists in AC2 being Rodrigo Borgia, and in Brotherhood, Rodrigo's son, Cesare Borgia. Rodrigo Borgia in AC2 is very patient, tactical, and smart. It takes him decades for his grand scheme to come to full fruition, and his role in Brotherhood is much smaller and takes a backseat to Cesare. Now Cesare is pretty much the polar opposite of Rodrigo. He's very aggressive and bold, and he doesn't carry out tasks secretly in the shadows. He goes around invading cities and towns with his large armies. This man wants to become the king of Italia, and he makes it well known. Cesare is very naive, and his desire and hunger for power causes him to be irrational and brash, without ever considering the consequences. To me, I couldn't even really tell what Cesare's true intentions and plan was, and quite truthfully, I don't really think he had any. He doesn't even have a grand purpose or allegiance like Rodrigo and the Templars from AC2. He's kinda just this big bad who wants to rule the world, and that made him a much shallower villain with not a whole lot of motivation or goals like Rodrigo from AC2, so this point is once again going to AC2. The next category is plot, which pretty much goes hand in hand with the first two categories. I think pretty much all of us can agree that the plot from AC2 is much more engaging and well written compared to Brotherhood. It's not that the plot from Brotherhood is bad by any means, but it does have a lot more filler and forgettable missions when compared to AC2. And the main arc of Brotherhood itself is very short, and it doesn't really have too many layers to it. It's also just missing those big twists and unpredictability that was so prevalent in AC2. So once again, AC2 takes this point. Pacing is very important in a game, and it's what keeps the player engaged in the game and entertained. And pacing to me is probably the biggest and one of the only flaws in AC2's story. The story just felt a bit too long in AC2 for me personally. There's so many times where you come this close to defeating Rodrigo, and then years go by before you get another opportunity, and it almost felt like this was solely done to increase the length of the story. Not to mention, the DLCs that are randomly placed towards the end of the game are horrible. The DLCs absolutely ruin the flow and pace of the game, as for some reason Ezio takes the apple to Forli, then he happens to drop it and this random guy takes it, and you just have to assassinate a bunch of random lieutenants. These sequences were so slow and boring and never should have been included in the game's main story. I also never really understood how there were so many gap years in AC2's story where seemingly nothing happened. Brotherhood is much better in this respect because it has a very clear focus and directive, and the pacing remains consistent and steady throughout the game's short main story. So Brotherhood wins this point. AC2 dominated the story category, but now we move on to gameplay, and let's start with the combat. This is a pretty easy point. AC2's combat was good, it was very smooth and enjoyable, but Brotherhood took the framework from AC2's combat and improved and refined it in pretty much every way. Better counter timing windows, more responsive movements, new animations, and the chain execution, which allowed you to infinitely chain your kills after getting an execution. Chain execute was a great addition and made the combat smoother and just allowed it to flow better. However, it did make the combat a lot easier, but regardless, combat was a huge step up in Brotherhood, so an easy point there. Stealth didn't see a huge upgrade and improvement like the combat, but Brotherhood does introduce some new assassin tools like the crossbow, along with the new guild assassination feature, which allowed you to recruit and command your assassins to kill any enemy in the vicinity. This added more depth and tools at your disposal, but again, it does make the game a lot easier, but I still much prefer the stealth over AC2, so another point for Brotherhood. Customization is another very easy one, because AC Brotherhood is really the first Assassin's Creed game to really take customization to another level. The amount of armor, weapons, and tools you could purchase was drastically increased and greatly improved from AC2. They also added a lot more robe dyes, which was also in AC2, but certainly not to the scale of Brotherhood. The increase in shops and the ability to renovate and invest in shops in Brotherhood was also a really nice addition and contributor to the customization, so another easy point for Brotherhood. The way the open worlds are handled in AC2 and Brotherhood are quite different. Assassin's Creed 2 has a lot of cities and smaller towns that you can travel to, like Firenze, Forlì, Florence, Venice, etc. Meanwhile, Brotherhood features just one large city in Rome. While it's certainly cool to travel to different locations and cities in AC2, you have to travel quite far and go through a lot of loading screens to do so. Not to mention, each city has a lot less detail and things to do since they had to put their focus into multiple cities. Meanwhile, in Brotherhood, all the focus was put into one large city, so as a result, it is very rich, detailed, and chock full of things to do. Not to mention, the color palette in Rome looks much more colorful and vibrant when compared to a lot of the cities in AC2, where many cities have a weird brown or yellow tint to them. Point Brotherhood. Side quests is another very simple one. AC2 has very little side quests. There are a few, but they are very far and few between. Meanwhile, Brotherhood has a large scale of side quests that actually have some really good side story threads attached to them that contribute to the overall arc, like the Christina and Leonardo da Vinci missions, so once again, point Brotherhood. After pure domination from Brotherhood in both gameplay and open world, Brotherhood holds the 6-3 lead over AC2, headed into our final category, presentation. And let's start with the graphics. So, not quite sure what happened, but for some reason, Brotherhood looks 10 times better than AC2, which is odd because it only came out a year after. But the textures, lighting, colors, it all looks fantastic in Brotherhood. AC2 certainly doesn't look bad, but the difference in graphics is night and day, so that's an easy point for Brotherhood. Now, normally whichever game wins the graphics category usually loses in performance, because obviously a better looking game is harder to run on a PC. But this is probably the one and only case where that is not true. On PC, Assassin's Creed 2 is locked to 60 FPS. Meanwhile, Brotherhood out here looking beautiful with uncapped frame rates to go with it, making the game much smoother. Brotherhood is one of the only old AC games to feature uncapped frame rates, and it is fantastic. Brotherhood is also a lot more polished compared to AC2. That's not to say it doesn't have its fair share of bugs, but they are a lot less frequent, so Brotherhood wins performance as well. Which brings us to the soundtrack. This point is obviously personal preference, and I love both game soundtracks, but I'm going to give this point to AC2 because it probably has one of the most iconic soundtracks in gaming history, and it has that ever so nostalgic Ezio's family, and no, not the ripoffs, the original. This brings us to our final score of Assassin's Creed 2 4 and Assassin's Creed Brotherhood 8, leaving AC Brotherhood as the better game. Now obviously this is my opinion, and depending on what you like in single player games, your opinion may differ. For example, if you think story is more important, then you'll likely prefer AC2 since it does have a much better story than Brotherhood, but if you prefer better gameplay mechanics, controls, open world, and graphics, then Brotherhood is the better game for you, which is what I believe personally. Again though, though, I still love AC2, and both of these games are definitely at the top of my favorite AC games, and you should definitely play AC2 before you try Brotherhood, so you can understand the story, since Brotherhood is a direct sequel after all. I hope you enjoyed this comparison video. Feel free to let me know which comparison you would like to see next. If you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate it if you left a like on the video and considered subscribing. Thanks for watching, and have a blessed day, Assassins.